The frost clings to the wattle and daub walls, pulling the damp chill directly into your bones. The air carries a sharp tang of wood smoke mixed with the undeniable stench of livestock and unwashed linen. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If stepping into these forgotten worlds helps you rest, consider subscribing for more. You open your eyes to the gray half-light filtering through the oiled linen that serves as your only window. The straw mattress beneath you shifts and rustles, announcing the presence of several unidentified insects that have been feeding on you since midnight. You sit up without haste, feeling the ache in your lower back from the uneven packed earth floor directly beneath your bed. A scrawny bolster cat uncoils from your feet, offering a faint purr before darting toward a scratching sound in the far corner. You swing your legs over the edge of the wooden platform, your bare feet meeting the freezing damp dirt of the floor. You shiver as the morning air bites through your single coarse linen shirt, the rough fabric scratching against skin that hasn't seen hot water in months. A distant church bell tolls the hour of prime, a heavy bronze note that reverberates through the mist-choked valley. This single sound commands the entire village, dictating the start of the laboring day with an authority no king could match. The goat tethered in the opposite corner of your single-room hovel lets out a demanding bleat, adding its voice to the rising symphony of medieval morning noise. Smoke from the banked hearth fire still lingers in the rafters, an acrid haze that coats the back of the throat and stings the eyes. The wooden beams above hold bundles of dried herbs and the ever-present threat of falling debris, dropping dust onto the minimal possessions you own. You reach for the heavy wool tunic draped over a nearby stool, its undyed brownish-gray fibers smelling faintly of wet sheep and old sweat. You pull it over your head, the material heavy and restrictive, settling unevenly over your linen undershirt. You grab your hosen, the two separate woolen leg coverings, and begin the frustrating daily task of tying them to your braided leather belt. You fumble with the stiff leather laces, your fingers numb from the morning chill, tying knots that will inevitably slip before the sun reaches its peak. You find your turn shoes, essentially leather pouches with no arch support, and slide your callous feet into their damp, unyielding interiors. You lace them up, knowing full well they will offer zero protection against the rocks and filth waiting just beyond your threshold. Outside the door, the village is already loud with the sounds of survival. A rooster screams its morning mandate, answered by the barking of semi-feral dogs fighting over scraps near the butcher's yard. The heavy thud of a blacksmith's hammer striking cold iron echoes from the forge down the lane, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that will continue until dusk. Voices carry through the damp air, sharp arguments over straying pigs, shouted greetings, the low murmur of gossip. The scent of the outside world creeps through the gaps in the doorframe, a complex olfactory assault of rotting vegetables, animal waste, and burning peat. You push the heavy wooden door open on its creaking leather hinges, stepping out into a morning that offers no warmth. You immediately step into a rut filled with semi-frozen mud and something significantly worse, the icy slush soaking instantly through the thin leather of your shoe. You grimace, pulling your foot free with a wet squelch, and adjust your stride to navigate the treacherous edges of the lane. You wrap your arms around your chest, trying to trap whatever body heat remains beneath the coarse wool of your tunic. You glance down the street, taking in the chaotic mix of free-roaming geese, discarded offal, and townsfolk hurrying toward their daily obligations. You watch a woman empty a wooden bucket directly into the open central gutter, the contents adding to the dark, sluggish river of filth running toward the stream. You turn your attention toward the urgent matter of breakfast, your stomach twisting with a familiar, hollow ache. You step back inside the hovel and approach the wooden board where the remnants of yesterday's bread sit beside a clay jug. You pick up the dense, dark maslin loaf, the crust hardened into something resembling stone during the freezing night. You use a heavy iron knife to saw off a manageable chunk, the blade struggling against the grit and coarse rye flour. You take a bite, the stone-ground flour crunching audibly against your teeth, wearing down the enamel with every chewing motion. You reach for the jug of small ale, the cloudy, slightly sour liquid offering the only safe hydration available in a world where drinking water is an invitation to deadly disease. The ale coats the tongue with a faint sweetness, masking the taste of the wooden vessel it has been stored in. It provides a meager burst of calories, just enough fuel to trick the body into facing the physical demands of the morning. Sunlight finally manages to pierce the heavy cloud cover, casting long, pale shadows across the packed dirt of the market square. The air remains stubbornly cold, the kind of biting chill that ignores layers of clothing and settles deep within the joints. A wooden cart clatters past, its ungreased axle shrieking in protest as an ox leans into the yoke, dragging a load of firewood toward the manor house. You step back out into the lane, chewing the last tough remnants of your bread, and join the stream of laborers heading toward the open fields. You notice the colors around you, the endless sea of drab browns, grays, and faded russets that visually define the peasant class in the year 1200. You see the miller's son wearing a slightly brighter blue cap, a tiny display of relative wealth that draws resentful glances from the men carrying mattocks. You tighten your leather belt, feeling the familiar heft of the iron sickle hanging at your hip. You walk past the church, its stone walls towering over the wooden and thatched structures of the village, a physical reminder of the power that governs both this life and the next. You bow your head slightly as you pass the heavy oak doors, a reflex born of genuine fear and the constant need to display acceptable piety. You reach the edge of the village, where the muddy lane gives way to the vast, undivided expanse of the arable lands. You locate your assigned strip of earth, a narrow band of soil scattered among dozens of others, indistinguishable to an outsider but intimately known to you. You grasp the long, rough-hewn ash handle of your mattock, the wood polished smooth by years of friction against blistered palms. You raise the heavy iron blade above your head, the muscles in your shoulders burning immediately as they resist the cold. You bring the tool down hard into the semi-frozen earth, the impact sending a violent shudder up your arms and rattling your teeth. You leverage the blade, tearing a chunk of dark soil free, beginning the endless, repetitive cycle of breaking the land. The field is alive with the synchronized motion of dozens of bodies engaged in identical labor. The rhythmic thud of iron striking dirt creates a low, percussive soundtrack that carries across the open acreage. Breath plumes in the frigid air, small white clouds rising from the hunched figures of men and women working the long furrows. An overseer on a brown horse paces the headland, his woolen cloak trimmed in badger fur, his eyes scanning the workers for any sign of slacking. A pair of massive oxen drag a heavy wooden plow through the toughest clay near the tree line, their breathing labored, their hooves sinking deep into the muck. You lean into the handle of your mattock, using your body weight to force the blade deeper into a stubborn knot of roots. You feel a blister tearing open on the inside of your thumb, the sharp sting registering briefly before being swallowed by the larger aches radiating through your back. You ignore the pain, shifting your grip slightly, and swing the tool again, matching the pace of the older man working the strip to your left. You focus your eyes on the ground directly in front of your feet, counting the swings, breaking the massive task into tiny, manageable pieces of survival. You smell the rich, raw scent of turned earth, a smell that signifies both the promise of future harvests and the immediate reality of brutal physical punishment. You wipe sweat from your forehead with the rough sleeve of your tunic, the wool scratching against your chilled skin. You pause for a fraction of a second, just long enough to draw a deep breath of the cold air, before the overseer's horse shifts its direction toward your section of the field. You immediately resume your swinging, terrified of the fines that could be levied against your meager portion of the autumn yield. You strike a buried stone, the loud crack ringing out, sending a fresh wave of numbness up your forearms. You dig around the obstruction with your bare fingers, your fingernails caked with freezing mud, and pry the heavy rock loose from its resting place. You toss it onto the growing pile at the edge of your strip, a monument to the endless battle between human desperation and geological stubbornness. You grab the mattock handle again, the wood now slick with the sweat and blood from your torn blister. The sun climbs higher, a pale disk burning through the thinning mist, though it offers light rather than true heat. The frost on the upper ridges of the furrows begins to melt, turning the topsoil into a slippery, treacherous slick of dark mud. The wind picks up, sweeping down from the northern hills, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant wood fires. A flock of crows descends on the freshly turned earth behind the plows, their harsh caws cutting through the mechanical sounds of human labor. They snatch exposed worms and grubs, thriving effortlessly on the margins of a system that grinds the human workers into dust. You steal a glance at the position of the sun, calculating the hours remaining before the church bell will signal the midday pause. You feel the hunger returning, a sharp cramp in your gut that demands more than the rock-hard bread you consumed at dawn. You shift your stance, your wet leather shoes providing zero traction in the slick mud, forcing you to balance awkwardly as you swing the heavy iron blade. You hear the overseer shout a command to a boy struggling with an ox team, the harsh words carrying easily on the wind. You lower your head, making yourself as small and unremarkable as possible, channeling all your energy into the precise, punishing motion of breaking the clods of dirt. You recognize the rhythm taking over your body, a trance-like state of continuous physical exertion that numbs the mind and protects you from the crushing reality of your existence. You step forward into the newly turned furrow, your foot sinking past the ankle into the freezing mire. You pull your leg free with a wet sucking sound, your calf muscles burning from the effort of fighting the gripping mud. You adjust the angle of your strike, focusing on a particularly dense patch of weeds that threatens to choke the soil before the barley can even be sown. You hack at the roots with vicious precision, the iron blade severing the tough plant matter with a satisfying crunch. You gather the severed weeds in your numb, muddy hands and toss them aside, knowing they will be gathered later to feed the village's insatiable fires. You feel a strange sense of accomplishment in the small, cleared patch of earth, a tiny victory in a war you can never truly win. The morning stretches out, an unbroken expanse of grueling toil measured only by the creeping shadows and the growing ache in every muscle. The village beyond the field seems distant, a cluster of thatched roofs and smoke plumes that represents the only sanctuary available in this harsh landscape. Children carrying wooden buckets arrive at the edge of the fields, bringing water from the river to slake the thirst of the laboring adults. The water is murky, carrying sediment and the invisible threats of upstream waste, but it is eagerly consumed by parched throats. The physical toll of the 12th century is written on the bodies of the workers, the bent spines, the swollen joints, the faces weathered into premature old age by constant exposure to the elements. You accept a wooden cup of river water from a young girl, her face smeared with soot and dirt, her expression blank and exhausted. You drink the cold liquid quickly, trying not to think about its source or the grit that settles against the back of your throat. You hand the cup back with a brief nod, the most elaborate gesture of thanks you can muster with arms that feel like lead weights. You pick up the mattock once more, its handle seemingly heavier than it was an hour ago, the wood pressing painfully against your raw palms. You cast a look down the long, unbroken line of your assigned strip, the untouched earth stretching out like a sentence handed down by a cruel judge. You forced your shoulders to rise, commanding your exhausted body to perform the impossible task of doing it all over again. You bring the blade down, the iron biting into the clay, the sound echoing your own silent desperation. You work your way toward the center of the field, the wind whipping your tunic against your legs, offering no defense against the dropping temperature. You notice the sky darkening in the west, heavy gray clouds gathering, promising rain that will turn this miserable task into a genuine nightmare. You redouble your efforts, swinging the mattock with a frantic energy born of the desire to finish the row before the storm breaks. You feel the sweat freezing on your skin, a chilling reminder of the delicate balance between exertion and exposure in this unforgiving era. You close your eyes for a split second, picturing the smoky, flea-ridden warmth of your hovel, using the image as a mental shield against the biting cold of the open field. A sudden shout rises from the far end of the field, cutting through the monotonous rhythm of the work. A horse is thrown askew, the heavy beast limping and halting the progress of the largest plow team on the manor. The overseer gallops toward the commotion, his face dark with fury, shouting orders that are swallowed by the wind. The temporary halt in the plow's progress creates a ripple effect, forcing the laborers behind it to pause their hoeing and wait. The cold immediately exploits the lack of movement, sinking into sweat-drenched tunics and stiffening overworked muscles within seconds. You lean against the handle of your tool, grateful for the unexpected reprieve, but wary of the chill settling over your shoulders. You watch the blacksmith's apprentice sprint across the frozen ridges, carrying a heavy leather bag of tools to address the injured horse. You flex your stiff, bloody fingers trying to keep the blood flowing, watching the stark contrast of bright red against the dark brown mud caking your skin. You observe the other peasants, their faces hollow and expressionless, standing like stone statues in the gray light of the late morning. You realize that this shared misery is the only true bond that connects you to these people, a silent brotherhood forged in dirt, cold and unrelenting labor. You grip the ashwood handle tightly as the overseer's voice cracks like a whip, signaling the resumption of the endless toil. You swing the mattock, the brief rest having made the iron feel twice its actual weight. You strike the ground, your body moving automatically, the physical memory of the task bypassing your exhausted conscious mind. You hear the distant hollow clang of the blacksmith's hammer carrying from the village, a reminder that the world outside this field is also bound to the anvil of labor. You feel a drop of icy rain strike your cheek, the first scout of the approaching storm, stinging like a tiny needle. You pull your shoulders up around your neck, bracing for the downpour, knowing that the work will not stop for something as trivial as weather. You keep your eyes fixed on the dirt, the only reality that matters in the brutal, beautiful, terrifying landscape of the year 1200. The freezing rain intensifies without warning, transforming the dark furrows into treacherous rivers of slick, impassable clay. Water streams down the coarse wool of the tunics around you, the fabric growing heavy and smelling strongly of wet sheep in the damp air. The overseer finally signals a temporary halt, pulling his restless horse toward the modest shelter of the ancient oaks lining the northern edge of the manor lands. Tools drop into the mud with heavy, defeated thuds as the line of workers fractures into a chaotic scramble for the tree line. This is the brutal reality of the 12th century weather, dictating every movement and punishing every delay. You trudge toward the dense thicket with the other laborers, your feet dragging through muck that threatens to pull your shoes off with every step. You find a spot beneath the thick, barren branches of a massive oak, the ancient trunk offering a slight windbreak against the driving squall. You press your back against the rough bark, shivering violently as the damp chill penetrates your base layer of linen. You watch the other peasants huddled in small groups, their faces obscured by the shadows in the driving sleet, creating a collective portrait of quiet endurance. You realize that true warmth is an impossible luxury in this season, a distant memory belonging to a summer you can barely recall. You focus your attention on the ground around the tree roots, searching for any dry, fallen branches that might serve as kindling later in the evening. You gather a handful of brittle twigs, snapping them carefully and stuffing them into the deep pouch tied to your leather belt. You feel the sharp sting of the freezing rain shifting to sleet, the tiny pellets of ice bouncing off the hardened earth with a sound like scattered seeds. You glance at the sky, a solid dome of bruised purple and gray that offers no indication of the true hour, though your empty stomach screams that midday is approaching. You pull your knees to your chest, wrapping your arms around your shins in a desperate bid to preserve whatever meager heat remains in your core. Silence falls over the huddled group, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of sleet against the wooden handles of discarded agricultural tools. Nobody complains about the cold because complaining expends precious energy and changes nothing about the harsh elements pressing down upon the valley. The storm eventually lessens to a persistent icy drizzle, leaving the fields thoroughly waterlogged and impossible to work until the topsoil drains. A horn blows from the direction of the distant manor house, a hollow, mournful blast that officially signals the midday pause and the temporary cessation of required labor. You rise stiffly from your crouched position, your joints screaming in protest after cooling down too rapidly in the damp air. You join the slow, limping procession back toward the cluster of wattle and daub cottages that make up the central village. You pass the heavy wooden structure of the watermill, the massive wheel turning ponderously under the weight of the swollen stream, groaning with every wet rotation. You smell the distinct dusty aroma of ground grain mingling with the wet earth, a scent that triggers a fresh wave of hollow hunger in your gut. You wipe the icy moisture from your brow, setting your sights on the small communal gathering space near the baker's oven where the daily ration of pottage might be waiting. The village mill stands as an unavoidable toll gate, controlling the community's primary source of survival. The heavy oak door stands propped open, revealing an interior choked with a fine, explosive dust that coats every surface in pale white powder. The massive millstones grind relentlessly against each other, pulverizing the rye and barley with a deafening, bone-rattling vibration that carries through the soles of the feet. The miller moves through the haze with practiced efficiency, a man deeply resented but vitally necessary, taking his obligatory portion of every sack brought through his doorway. You step briefly into the overhang of the mill's thatched roof, seeking a momentary respite from the persistent drizzle before heading toward the ovens. You watch the heavy sacks of grain being hoisted by thick hemp ropes, the coarse fibers fraying under the incredible tension of the load. You hear the creak of the wooden gear shifting, a complex piece of medieval engineering that demands constant grease and careful attention. You cough as the flour dust catches in your throat, adding a dry, choking sensation to the wet misery already clinging to your wool tunic. You back out into the muddy lane, deciding that the cold rain is preferable to suffocating inside the noisy, dusty structure. You cross the central square toward the communal ovens, the heat radiating from the thick clay walls creating a localized pocket of hazy warmth in the freezing air. You join the short line of villagers waiting for their baked goods, the smell of charred crusts and wood ash acting as a physical magnet for your starved body. You fish a single tarnished copper coin from the depths of your pouch, the metal cold and insignificant against your calloused palm. You hand the coin to the baker's wife, a stern woman with forearms as thick as the oak logs she feeds into the roaring fire. You accept a small, dense loaf of dark bread, the crust still radiating a beautiful, fierce heat that instantly warms your frozen, muddy hands. Smoke billows from the open mouth of the oven, stinging the eyes of everyone standing in the immediate vicinity. The baker uses a long wooden peel to maneuver massive loaves deep within the glowing cavern, executing a dance of practiced timing and blistering heat. Sparks fly upward into the gray afternoon sky, tiny orange stars that die instantly upon contact with the relentless sleet. The surrounding mud is trampled flat by dozens of wooden clogs and leather shoes, forming a dense, slippery perimeter that requires careful, deliberate footing to navigate without falling. You break the warm bread apart with your thumbs, the hard crust yielding to reveal a steaming, chewy interior that smells of yeast and survival. You chew the coarse crumbs slowly, letting the heat radiate through your chest, ignoring the gritty texture of the stone-ground flour against your teeth. You lean against a wooden fence post, closing your eyes just long enough to savor the immediate, desperate relief of calories entering your exhausted system. You feel the sleep melting against the back of your neck, sending icy rivulets down your spine beneath the heavy, saturated wool. You open your eyes and watch a pair of stray dogs fighting over a discarded crust in the gutter, their growls mixing with the hiss of rain turning to steam on the hot oven stones. You finish the last morsel of the bread, knowing it must sustain you until the evening pottage is finally served. You observe the sky directly overhead, noting the subtle shift from the flat gray of midday to the bruised, heavy, leaden color of early afternoon. You turn your steps toward the southern edge of the village, where a cluster of communal sheds requires urgent repair before the true winter sets in. You find an adze resting against a chopping block, the iron blade dull and rusted, a tool left abandoned by another worker seeking shelter earlier in the day. You pick up the heavy implement, testing the weight against your tired muscles, resigning yourself to a different kind of grueling physical labor for the remainder of the daylight hours. The repair work demands a steady, brutal rhythm of chopping and shaping damp timber. Thick oak logs sit piled in the mud, their bark slick with freezing rain and coated in a layer of greenish moss. Wood chips fly through the air with every strike of the adze, embedding themselves in the muck or bouncing off the leather aprons of the men working nearby. The physical exertion generates a temporary localized body heat, a welcome defense against the dropping temperature, though it comes at the cost of rapidly depleting your remaining energy reserves. You swing the adze down into the side of a thick oak beam, the blade biting deep into the wet-resistant wood with a dull thud. You twist the handle to pop the large chip free, the repetitive motion sending fresh jolts of pain through your already blistered hands. You wipe a mixture of rain and sweat from your brow, using the back of your wrist, leaving a smear of dark mud across your face. You hear the distant braying of a pack mule navigating the main road, a solitary sound that underscores the isolation of this rural 12th century existence. You set your jaw and swing the tool again, matching your breathing to the endless, punishing cycle of striking and pulling. Surrendering to the mechanical necessity of the task, you notice the light beginning to thicken, the sharp sleet turning into a heavy wet snow that coats the surrounding roofs in a pristine layer of white. You pause to inspect the edge of the timber, running your thumb along the roughened grain to check the depth of your cuts. You pull your tunic tighter around your waist, the wool now heavy with moisture and offering the warmth of a wet sponge against your shivering skin. You calculate the remaining hours of daylight, knowing that the overseer will not call a halt until the sun actually dips below the distant, unseen horizon. You heft the adze back over your shoulder, your breath forming dense white plumes in the increasingly frigid air, and prepare to finish the agonizingly slow work of shaping the beam. The wet snow accumulates rapidly, transforming the muddy village into a deceptively peaceful landscape of muffled sounds and softened edges. Footsteps no longer squelch in the muck, but crunch softly against the packing slush, leaving dark, watery prints that freeze within minutes. The heavy thatch roofs bear the weight of the sudden snowfall, their steep angles shedding chunks of white powder that fall with soft thuds into the alleys below. A profound hush settles over the valley as the weather drives the animals into their shelters, leaving only the desperate human laborers outside to battle the elements. You strike the wood one final time, the adze lodging firmly in the heartwood, signaling the completion of the required shaping. You pry the blade loose and drop the heavy tool into the snow, your arms trembling so violently you can barely unclench your fingers. You kneel beside the shaped beam, inspecting the crude but functional joints that will hold the communal shed together for another harsh season. You feel the cold seeping through the knees of your hosen, the wet fabric adhering uncomfortably to your freezing skin. You stand up slowly, your lower back locked in a tight knot of pain, and survey the quiet, snowy expanse of the afternoon village. You make your way toward the blacksmith's forge, seeking both a replacement wedge for a split handle and the desperate comfort of the roaring fire. You push past the heavy leather curtain that covers the doorway, the sudden wall of intense heat hitting you like a physical blow. You step into the cavernous, soot-stained workspace, the air thick with the metallic tang of hot iron, burning coal, and the sharp scent of horse sweat. You watch the massive bellows expanding and contracting, driven by a panting apprentice who uses his entire body weight to pump oxygen into the blindingly bright coals. You edge closer to the radiant heat of the forge, letting the warmth slowly thaw your frozen tunic, ignoring the dangerous sparks that rain down onto the packed earth floor. The smith stands over the massive iron anvil, a towering figure clad in a scorched leather apron that bears the scars of 1,000 errant embers. His heavy hammer rises and falls with terrifying, precise power, reshaping a glowing rod of iron into a plowshare with rhythmic, deafening strikes. The metal rings out with a clear, high-pitched tone that vibrates through the jawbones of everyone standing in the cramped space. Heat radiates from the cooling iron in shimmering waves, distorting the air and casting massive, frantic shadows against the back wall of the workshop. You present your broken tool handle to the smith during a brief pause in his hammering, holding the splintered wood out with a quiet deference. You observe the deep soot ground into the lines of his face, a permanent mask of his trade that no amount of scrubbing will ever remove. You hand over another precious copper coin, watching it disappear into a blackened leather pouch tied heavily to his wide belt. You take the freshly forged iron wedge he offers, the metal still surprisingly warm to the touch, a small piece of captured heat in the freezing afternoon. You linger near the forge for one more precious minute, soaking in the life-giving warmth before turning back toward the leather curtain and the unforgiving winter storm waiting outside. You step back into the lane, the contrast between the forge's blistering heat and the snowy air causing you to gasp sharply. You carry the iron wedge in your bare hand, using its residual warmth to thaw your stiff, painful fingers as you walk. You navigate the winding path between the cottages, dodging a massive, ice-crusted wagon parked awkwardly in the center of the thoroughfare. You hear the distant sound of the church bell ringing for none, marking the middle of the afternoon and the slow, inevitable slide toward dusk. You press forward toward your final task of the day, knowing that the brutal survival math of the 12th century allows for zero wasted daylight. You carry the newly forged wedge toward the communal sheds, the snow continuing to fall in thick, wet flakes that cling to your eyelashes. The heavy oak beam awaits your return, its rough-hewn surface collecting a thin layer of freezing slush. You position the iron wedge into the split end of the timber, aligning it carefully with your numb fingers. You lift the heavy wooden mallet, bringing it down squarely onto the flat iron head with a resounding thud. The wedge bites into the grain, forcing the tough wood apart with a sharp cracking sound that echoes off the nearby wattle walls. The physical effort sends a fresh wave of heat through your chest, combating the biting chill of the late afternoon air. You strike the mallet again and again, establishing a steady rhythm that numbs your mind to the mounting pain in your shoulders. Snow gathers on the shoulders of your coarse tunic, the wool absorbing the moisture until it feels like a weighted blanket pressing you into the mud. You watch the wood split perfectly along the grain, a small victory in a day defined by endless struggle and discomfort. You drop the mallet, your hand shaking slightly from the prolonged exertion and the steep drop in temperature. You use the edge of your adze to clean the split, sending pale wooden splinters flying into the darkening slush at your feet. The other laborers have already moved on to different tasks, leaving you isolated in the quiet snowfall. You push the heavy beam into its designated slot within the shed framework, the joints groaning under the sudden weight. You wipe the freezing slush from your face with the back of a filthy hand, turning your attention to the next critical chore of the fading day. You must secure water before the darkness renders the village paths unnavigable and genuinely dangerous. You trudge back to your hovel to retrieve a wooden bucket, the leather handle stiff and unyielding in the frigid air. You join the small procession of villagers heading toward the central well, their heads bowed against the relentless, biting wind. The path is a treacherous ribbon of packed snow and hidden ice ruts, requiring deliberate, calculated steps to avoid a bone-breaking fall. You pass the looming silhouette of the parish church, its stone walls looking even more imposing against the darkening winter sky. The communal well sits at the intersection of two muddy lanes, a circular stone wall topped with a rotting wooden windlass. You join the short line, shifting your weight from one freezing foot to the other while waiting your turn. You listen to the creak of the turning mechanism and the wet splash of the wooden bucket hitting the dark water far below the surface. The woman ahead of you hauls her load upward, the frayed hemp rope dripping icy water onto the trampled snow. You step up to the stone edge, grabbing the rough handle of the windlass with hands that barely possess the strength to grip. You release the catch, sending your own bucket plummeting into the unseen depths with a hollow, echoing clatter. You lean over the damp stone, bracing your core as the rope snaps taut with the weight of the filled vessel. You begin the arduous process of turning the crank, your biceps screaming in protest as they lift the heavy load, foot by painful foot. The wet hemp rope sheds icy droplets onto your forearms, the cold biting sharply into your exposed skin. You haul the bucket over the lip of the well, the murky water sloshing over the sides and soaking the knees of your hosen. You peer into the liquid, noting the floating bits of debris and the cloudy appearance that signifies the ever-present danger of medieval water supplies. You know this water must be boiled for ale, a necessary process to kill the invisible threats lurking within the village water table. A sudden commotion near the market square draws your attention away from the heavy wooden bucket. You carry your burden toward the noise, the sloshing water freezing onto the rim of the vessel before it can drip to the ground. You see a small crowd gathered around the wooden stocks, pointing and jeering at a hunched figure locked within the heavy timber frame. You recognize the baker's apprentice, his wrists and ankles secured by thick iron padlocks, his face a mask of misery and endurance. Someone throws a rotten turnip from the back of the crowd, the decaying vegetable striking the wooden frame with a wet thud. You watch the brutal reality of 12th century justice unfold, a public spectacle designed to enforce order through humiliation and physical suffering. The segmented nature of medieval rest demands a patience that borders on torture, forcing you to lie awake in the frigid dark. You count the slow beats of your pulse, using the rhythm to anchor your wandering, feverish thoughts against the encroaching despair of the long cold. The freezing air becomes a physical weight pressing down on your chest, restricting your lungs and making every exhalation a white plume in the unseen space. You visualize the heavy iron mattock lying frozen in the muddy furrows, an instrument of daily punishment that awaits your eventual return. You banish the thought immediately, focusing instead on the tiny, immediate goal of surviving the next breath, the next minute, the next endless hour of the long medieval night. You shift your weight against the unyielding wooden platform, seeking a pocket of straw that has not yet been crushed flat by your freezing body. The rough fibers of the mattress poke to the thin linen of your under tunic, scratching against skin that is already irritated by dirt and dried sweat. You reach a numb hand down to massage your lower back, tracing the hard lines of muscle locked in a perpetual state of defensive tension. The darkness offers no visual distraction from the physical reality of your battered frame, forcing you to map every ache and blister with acute, unbroken focus. You realize that your body is a ledger of the village's collective labor, recording every swing of the mattock and every hauled bucket of icy well water. The 12th century night demands a grim accounting of these physical debts, tallying the cost of survival in the slow, throbbing rhythm of your bruised joints. A low, mournful whistle develops in the gaps around the heavy oak door, the wind finding new paths through the shrinking frozen timber. The sound resembles a human voice, a solitary lament that blends perfectly with the oppressive isolation of the wakeful interval. You listen to the pitch rise and fall, measuring the invisible strength of the storm pressing against the fragile wattle and daub exterior. The heavy latch rattles slightly in its iron housing, a metallic vibration that translates directly into the dense, frigid air of the room. You pull the heavy woolen cloak tighter across your chin, breathing your own warm exhalations back into the coarse fabric to protect your cracked lips. You accept the howling wind as a permanent companion, a reminder that the natural world in this era operates with a brutal, indifferent authority. You turn your head toward the far corner, attempting to locate the goat entirely by the sound of its chewing and the faint scent of damp fleece. The animal stamps a cloven hoof against the packed earth floor, scraping away a thin layer of frost to find a softer resting place. You rely on these minor auditory cues to anchor yourself in the pitch-black space, constructing a mental map of your small domain when your eyes cannot function. You feel a sudden, sharp drop in the ambient air pressure, a subtle atmospheric shift that often precedes the heaviest snowfall of the winter season. You swallow against a dry throat, tasting the lingering grit of stone-ground flour from the evening's meager ration of hardened bread. The sensory deprivation of the lightless room amplifies every minor physical sensation, turning a simple itch or a cramped toe into an urgent, overwhelming focus. The heavy silence forces your thoughts to drift toward the massive stone abbey sitting on the elevated ridge beyond the village borders. You picture the monks moving through their unheated stone corridors, their breath pluming in the freezing air as they gather for the deepest night prayers. You imagine the flicker of their beeswax candles casting long, distorted shadows against the vaulted ceilings, a tiny pocket of organized light in a world consumed by winter. The religious men operate on a schedule dictated entirely by devotion, their voices rising in Latin chants that you cannot understand but respect with a primal, deeply ingrained fear. You understand that their spiritual labor is considered just as vital as your physical toil, a parallel effort to hold back the darkness and secure the safety of the harvest. You cross yourself beneath the heavy blanket, a blind, automatic gesture of piety meant to ward off the nameless terrors that inhabit the midnight hours. You run your thumb along the hem of your wool tunic, feeling the uneven weave and the thick, coarse knots left by the village spinster. The fabric tells a story of relentless wear, patched in several places with scraps of older, even rougher material stitched together with stiff linen thread. You find a tear near the knee, a jagged rip earned from kneeling in the frozen mud while attempting to repair the communal sheds earlier in the week. You know that mending the garment will require precious daylight and nimble fingers, two resources that are critically scarce during the brutal winter months. You fold the damaged edge over, tucking it securely beneath your thigh to prevent the icy draft from exploiting the vulnerability in your only layer of defense. You treat your clothing not as an accessory, but as primary armor, a vital barrier separating your fragile body from the lethal, sub-zero environment. The night stretches forward without any reliable marker of progress, a seamless expanse of freezing black that defies the passage of hours. You wait for the distant church bell to signal lauds, the pre-dawn prayer that will finally announce the beginning of the end of this dark trial. You track the slow, agonizing stiffening of your joints, the cold seeping deeper into the synovial fluid and turning simple movements into monumental efforts. You hear a sharp crack from the thatched roof, a massive icicle snapping under its own weight and plummeting to the frozen mud of the lane below. You analyze the sound, determining that the structural integrity of the roof remains intact, a small blessing that allows you to maintain your precarious position on the mattress. You surrender to the vast, empty hours, understanding that patience in the medieval winter is indistinguishable from mere survival. You inhale sharply through your nose, analyzing the complex layers of odor trapped within the sealed cottage. The sharp, acrid bite of old wood ash dominates the air, a chemical reminder of the thousands of fires burned on that very spot over generations. You detect the sour, unmistakable scent of unwashed wool mingling with the musky, earthy aroma of the goat's bedding in the opposite corner. You notice a faint metallic tang hovering near the floorboards, the smell of freezing moisture crystallizing against the packed earth. You know this unique combination of scents intimately, recognizing it as the defining fragrance of your existence, a smell that clings to your skin and hair even after the rare visit to the public bathhouse. You breathe it in deeply, accepting the harsh reality that this foul, stagnant air is the only thing keeping your lungs functioning. You begin to mentally inventory the tools leaning against the far wall, visualizing their rusted iron heads and splintered ash handles in the total dark. You picture the adze with its chipped blade, recalling the exact angle required to strike the frozen timber without shattering the fragile metal edge. You remember the heavy iron wedge resting near the hearth, its surface still retaining a ghost of the heat it absorbed from the blacksmith's roaring forge. You plan the sequence of your morning labor, mapping out the precise movements needed to fetch water, clear the snow, and break the ice from the communal trough. You use this detailed mental planning to block out the overwhelming urge to simply give up, replacing the despair of the freezing night with a rigid, structured blueprint for the coming day. You forge a mental armor of chores and obligations, an invisible shield that protects your fragile sanity from the crushing weight of the 12th century winter. A subtle change in the air pressure registers against your eardrums, a heavy, deadening sensation that often accompanies the deepest, most lethal cold of the night cycle. You hear the timber frame of the hovel groan in response, the green wood shrinking and twisting as the temperature hits its absolute nadir. You feel the frost creeping closer to the edge of your straw mattress, an encroaching white border that threatens to consume the last remaining pocket of residual warmth. You wrap your arms tightly around your ribs, locking your jaw to prevent your teeth from chattering loud enough to startle the sleeping goat. You focus your wide, unseeing eyes on the space where the door should be, willing the heavy oak planks to hold fast against the invisible, freezing assault. You endure the darkest portion of the night with a silent, fierce determination, knowing that the sun must eventually breach the horizon, even if its light offers no real heat. You scrape your fingernail against the rough wooden edge of the sleeping platform, the sharp sound cutting through the oppressive silence like a tiny knife. You feel the deep grooves and splinters left by the crude iron tools that shape the timber, the texture providing a tangible connection to the physical world. You press your palm flat against the wood, absorbing the biting cold that radiates from the damp earth just inches below your resting place. You understand that this crude, uncomfortable bed is a luxury compared to the frozen mud of the lane, a reality that offers a grim sort of comfort. You shift your hips slightly, finding a new arrangement of aches that feels marginally more tolerable than the last, a continuous, microscopic negotiation with your environment. You accept the pain as proof of life, a constant physical feedback loop that confirms you have not yet surrendered to the freezing dark. The distant, mournful cry of a hunting owl drifts across the valley, a solitary sound that reinforces the profound isolation of the village. You track the bird's unseen flight path over the snow-covered fields, imagining the silent swoop of its wings as it searches for mice huddled in the frozen furrows. You recognize the owl as a fellow survivor, a creature perfectly adapted to the lethal conditions that currently threaten to extinguish your own life. You listen for the terrified squeal of its prey, but the night yields nothing but the relentless howling wind and the cracking of ice. You feel a strange sense of kinship with the nocturnal hunter, both of you navigating a hostile, unforgiving landscape where the penalty for failure is immediate and final. You let the wild sound wash over you, a reminder that the world beyond your wattle walls remains untamed, dangerous, and utterly indifferent to your suffering. You turn your attention back toward the invisible hearth, the vital center of your home that currently sits dormant beneath its blanket of gray ash. You calculate the remaining hours until the dawn bell, trying to determine the exact moment when it will be safe to unearth the hidden embers. You know that exposing the coals too early will consume the last of your kindling, leaving you without a fire for the critical morning preparations. You picture the small, blackened iron pot waiting nearby, ready to receive the chipped ice and meager grain that will constitute your first meal. You discipline your shivering hands, keeping them firmly tucked beneath the wool cloak, resisting the overwhelming temptation to seek the fire's warmth prematurely. You practice the harsh art of medieval patience, prioritizing the long-term strategy of the day over the immediate, agonizing demands of the freezing night. The dull throb of a neglected toothache flares suddenly in your lower jaw, a sharp, pulsing pain triggered by the relentless cold air. You press your tongue against the damaged enamel, feeling the rough, decaying edge that has plagued you since the autumn harvest. You know there is no remedy available beyond the brutal, unsanitary extraction offered by the village barber surgeon, a prospect far more terrifying than the pain itself. You clamp your jaw shut, breathing exclusively through your nose to prevent the freezing drafts from aggravating the exposed nerve further. You categorize the toothache as just another permanent feature of your physical landscape, a chronic misery that must be endured alongside the hunger, the lice, and the cold. You swallow the pain, burying it deep within the general ache of your battered body, refusing to let it break your concentration on the primary task of staying alive. You watch the frost patterns on the wattle walls slowly sharpen into focus as the absolute blackness seems to thin imperceptibly toward a dense charcoal gray. The intricate branching designs of the ice resemble the delicate veins of a winter leaf, a momentary flash of natural beauty in a space defined entirely by squalor. You study the crystalline structures with wide, exhausted eyes, finding a strange, hypnotic calm in their cold perfection. You know that the moment the hearth fire is stoked, these beautiful formations will melt into muddy streaks that run down the plaster and pool on the dirt floor. You appreciate the temporary art, a fleeting masterpiece created by the very elements that are actively trying to kill you. You trace the largest ice vein with your gaze, following its path from the thatched ceiling down to the frozen earth, mapping the slow, creeping invasion of the winter storm into your private sanctuary. You listen to the sound of your own heartbeat, the steady rhythmic thud drumming, a persistent counter-rhythm to the chaotic wind outside. The pulse feels sluggish, a slow, labored pumping that reflects the overall lethargy, gripping your freezing, undernourished frame. You mentally inventory the specific locations of your frostnip, noting the severe numbness in your left heel and the stinging sensation along the ridge of your collarbone. You rotate your shoulders within the tight confines of the wool cloak, the stiff joints popping audibly in the quiet room, protesting the minimal movement. You accept this physical degradation as the standard currency of the 12th-century peasant, the biological cost paid daily for the privilege of occupying this tiny corner of the feudal system. You set your jaw, locking away the physical suffering in a dark corner of your mind, ready to face the brutal demands of the impending daylight with the stoic, unbreakable endurance of a survivor. You maintain your rigid posture on the wooden platform, refusing to let the shivering overcome your strict physical control. The coarse wool of the cloak offers a meager barrier against the plunging temperature, capturing just enough body heat to prevent outright freezing. Your frozen breath falls back upon your own face, a mist of condensation that clings to your cracked lips and chills your skin. You flex the stiff muscles in your jaw, working away the dull ache that has settled into the hinge of your bone from hours of clenching. The brutal mathematics of the 12th century winter dictate every minor movement, requiring you to weigh the benefit of adjusting your numb limbs against the cost of exposing them to the lethal drafts. Frost continues its silent march across the interior of the wattle and daub walls, laying down thick, white tracks over the dried mud plaster. The moisture in the cramped space freezes into intricate, jagged, crystalline structures that reflect no light in the pitch-black room. A sharp snap echoes from the thatched roof overhead as another heavy icicle breaks loose and plummets into the snowbank outside. The structural timbers of the hovel groan in response to the shifting weight, the ancient oak beams contracting further in the bitter air. The freezing process acts like a slow vise closing around the village, squeezing the warmth out of every living thing trapped within its perimeter. You slide your frozen hands further into the armpits of your rough linen undershirt, seeking the last remaining pockets of core heat. The fabric feels brittle and unyielding, having absorbed the sweat from your earlier labor in the muddy furrows before chilling against your flesh. You trace the prominent ridges of your own ribs with numb fingertips, feeling the hollow spaces left by months of inadequate stone-ground rations. You recall the taste of the thin onion pottage from the evening meal, a memory that offers no physical comfort to your cramping, empty stomach. The starvation of the winter months is a calculated endurance test, an endless waiting game played against the distant promise of the spring planting season. Somewhere beyond the heavy oak door, the wind shifts its angle, finding new vulnerabilities in the primitive construction of your shelter. A concentrated jet of icy air slices beneath the threshold, cutting across the packed earth floor and striking the base of your sleeping platform. The sudden drop in ambient temperature bites through your leather turn shoes resting near the dead hearth, stiffening the damp material into frozen, unusable shapes. You pull your knees tighter against your chest, folding your battered frame into the most compact arrangement possible to defend your vital organs. The physical isolation of the long night amplifies the sensation of the cold, transforming it from a weather condition into a relentless personal adversary. You listen to the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the tethered goat in the opposite corner, the sound serving as a vital anchor in the disorienting darkness. The animal shuffles its hooves against the dirt, digging through the thin layer of scattered rushes in a futile search for warmer ground. You understand that the beast represents a crucial fraction of your survival strategy, its residual body heat contributing to the fragile microclimate of the single-room dwelling. The strong, musky odor of the damp fleece thickens the stagnant air, mingling with the pervasive smell of stale wood ash and old sweat. You rely on these crude sensory inputs to maintain your spatial awareness, constructing a mental map of your unseen surroundings through sound and scent alone. Shadows remain non-existent without a light source to cast them, leaving the interior of the cottage submerged in a heavy, featureless void. The sensory deprivation forces your mind to project memories onto the blank canvas of the room, recalling the chaotic, filthy reality of the village lanes. You picture the open central gutter running through the market square, frozen solid now, trapping the accumulated waste of the community in a ridge of dirty ice. You visualize the heavy iron stock standing empty in the snow, a grim monument to the unforgiving nature of medieval justice waiting for its next occupant. The mental review of these harsh landmarks provides a strange, morbid grounding, reminding you that the brutal world outside these walls is just as lethal as the freezing air inside. You press the back of your head against the crushed straw of the mattress, the dry stalks offering no cushion against the hard wooden planks beneath. The persistent itch of lice moving through your unwashed hair flares up, an irritation aggravated by the tight confines of your drawn wool cloak. You resist the urge to scratch, knowing that breaking the seal of your blanket would release a precious pocket of captured warmth into the frozen room. You endure the crawling sensation with the same practiced stoicism you apply to the blistered skin on your palms and the deep aches in your lower lumbar region. The ability to compartmentalize physical suffering is the primary mechanism of survival for the peasant class, a learned trait passed down through generations of relentless labor. A tiny, frantic scratching noise emanates from the base of the hearthstones, betraying the presence of a mouse seeking the faint residual warmth of the buried embers. The vermin scuttle across the frozen dirt, their miniature claws clicking rapidly before vanishing into a hidden gap in the wattle construction. You track their unseen progress without opening your eyes, acknowledging their parallel struggle to outlast the lethal conditions of the pre-dawn hours. The shared misery of the winter connects every living creature in the valley, from the apex predators hunting in the distant tree line to the insects huddled in the thatch. You view the rodents not as pests, but as fellow prisoners in this frozen cell, bound by the same ruthless rules of 12th-century existence. You focus your concentration on the slow, deliberate expansion of your lungs, drawing the stinging, frigid air through your nose to warm it slightly before it hits your chest. The metallic taste of the cold registers on your tongue, a sharp, elemental flavor that dominates the atmosphere of the unheated hovel. You force the breath out in a slow, controlled stream, feeling the condensation freeze instantly against the rough fibers of the blanket covering your mouth. You repeat the mechanical process of respiration, using the counting of your breaths to impose a sense of order on the sprawling, chaotic void of the wakeful interval. The simple act of breathing becomes an arduous physical chore, requiring conscious effort to overcome the restrictive pressure of the dropping temperature. The absolute stillness of the village suggests that even the watchmen have abandoned their posts, seeking shelter from the life-threatening cold. The absence of human activity outside leaves the settlement feeling abandoned, a cluster of silent, snow-covered tombs huddled against the edge of the sprawling forest. You imagine the other laborers lying in their identical wattle structures, engaged in the same desperate, shivering battle against the elements. You understand that this collective endurance is the unspoken foundation of the feudal system, the invisible mortar that holds the rigid hierarchy together. The survival of the manor depends entirely on the ability of the lowest class to withstand these punishing conditions without surrendering to the frost. You shift your weight onto your side, the movement causing a cascade of loud, brittle crunches from the dried straw beneath your body. The new position offers a fleeting illusion of relief, before a different set of muscles begins to throb in protest against the unyielding wooden boards. You tuck your chin downward, bringing your frozen face closer to the limited warmth radiating from your own chest beneath the linen shirt. You feel the rough, uneven stitching of a patch on your sleeve, the coarse thread scraping against the sensitive skin of your inner arm. The tactile sensation grounds you in the immediate present, pulling your wandering thoughts back from the edge of the numbing, dangerous lethargy that precedes hypothermia. Ice begins to coat the interior of the heavy oak door, creeping inward from the iron latch in a spiderweb pattern of frozen moisture. The visual proof of the invading cold remains hidden in the dark, but you can feel the ambient temperature plunging toward its lowest point of the night cycle. You tighten your grip on your own arms, feeling the tremor in your muscles escalate into a steady, violent shudder that shakes your entire frame. You lock your jaw to prevent your teeth from clattering, refusing to surrender to the panic that accompanies the rapid loss of core body heat. You rely on sheer, unadulterated willpower to maintain your defensive posture, treating your own body as a fortress under siege by the winter air. You cast your memory back to the blistering heat of the communal ovens during the midday pause, a desperate attempt to summon a phantom warmth. You visualize the baker's wife sliding the massive loaves onto the glowing stones, the intense radiation burning the moisture from the air and stinging your face. You try to recall the exact sensation of the hot crust against your freezing hands, the sudden glorious burst of heat that thawed your blistered fingers. The memory remains stubbornly elusive, a distant, abstract concept that fails to counter the immediate, crushing reality of the sub-zero room. The psychological trick proves useless against the physical authority of the weather, forcing you to face the cold without the crutch of pleasant illusions. The heavy, oppressive weight of the pre-dawn hour presses down on the valley, a localized atmospheric pressure that seems to squeeze the oxygen from the air. You hear the timber frame of the cottage groan again, a long, agonizing creak of shrinking oak that reverberates through the packed earth floor. You listen for the distant tolling of the church bell, the only authorized signal that this endless, dark trial is finally approaching its conclusion. The silence stretches on without interruption, a vast, indifferent expanse of time that refuses to acknowledge your suffering or your anticipation. You settle deeper into the rough wool of your cloak, bracing yourself for the agonizingly slow crawl toward the first gray light of the medieval morning. You keep your eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness, allowing your other senses to map the microscopic changes occurring within the frozen hovel. The heavy wool of your cloak feels stiff against your chin, the moisture from your own breath having frozen the coarse fibers into a rigid collar. You feel the steady rhythm of your pulse beating against the packed straw of the mattress, a tiny percussion that anchors your mind against the creeping lethargy. You recognize the specific, dull ache settling into your knee joints, an inescapable souvenir from countless hours spent kneeling in the damp furrows during the autumn sowing. Absolute silence dominates the final hours before dawn, a thick atmospheric pressure that seems to squeeze the remaining oxygen from the stagnant air. The wattle and daub walls absorb the quiet, the dried mud plaster serving as a fragile barrier between your fragile existence and the lethal winter exposure. Frost continues its expansion across the interior surfaces, transforming the rough-hewn timber beams into smooth, pale monuments of solid ice. A single brittle snap echoes from the far corner of the ceiling, indicating another layer of frozen slush separating from the overmatched thatch. The structure feels suspended in an unnatural stasis. It resembles a frozen wooden box waiting for the distant sun to release it from the season's brutal grip. You slide your right hand down the length of your shivering torso, seeking any stray pocket of residual warmth trapped beneath the coarse linen shirt. You trace the prominent, bony ridges of your ribcage, the physical evidence of a 12th-century diet that barely sustains the massive caloric demands of daily agricultural labor. You visualize the meager collection of dried peas sitting in the woven basket near the hearth, calculating the minimum ration required to fuel your impending morning chores. You force the sharp pangs of hunger aside, categorizing the hollow cramping in your stomach as a permanent, baseline condition that requires no further attention. You focus instead on the immediate task of preserving your core temperature, locking your muscles into a rigid, defensive posture against the encroaching chill. Smoke from the dying hearth fire lingers stubbornly in the enclosed space, a bitter, acrid perfume of charred oak and gray ash. The odor embeds itself deep into the wool blankets, the straw mattress, and the unwashed pores of your own skin. This permanent smoky scent serves as the defining olfactory signature of the medieval peasantry. The fragrance remains a marker of class as distinct as the undyed cloth of your tunic. The subtle undertone of damp earth rises from the packed dirt floor, an ancient, familiar smell that reminds you of the newly turned fields waiting beyond the village boundaries. The stagnant air offers zero ventilation, forcing you to continuously cycle the same frozen, foul-smelling breath through your exhausted lungs. You turn your head a fraction of an inch, listening intently to the heavy respiration of the goat tethered just a few feet away. You picture the animal's thick, matted fleece in the absolute darkness, understanding the vital insulation the rough coat provides against the sub-zero environment. You hear a cloven hoof scrape against the frozen earth, a dull, scraping noise that briefly shatters the oppressive quiet before being swallowed by the stillness. You know that the goat's survival is inextricably linked to your own, its future milk and eventual meat representing the narrow margin between starvation and endurance. Iron leans against the wattle wall near the door, its ashwood handle hidden in the lightless void. The rusted metal blade holds the memory of 1,000 strikes against the stubborn clay. The physical toll of that labor currently throbs in your bruised palms. The tool functions as an extension of your own broken body. It stands as an essential instrument of survival that demands a daily sacrifice of sweat, blood, and deteriorating cartilage. The heavy head was forged in the blinding heat of the village smithy. That chaotic, soot-stained sanctuary feels like a distant fantasy in this freezing hour. The mere thought of lifting the heavy implement again sends a preemptive wave of exhaustion crashing through your stiff, shivering limbs. You pull the heavy cloak tighter around your shoulders, attempting to seal a newly discovered draft that is slicing across the back of your neck. You feel the rough, uneven stitching of the hem pressing into your collarbone, the crude thread a testament to the hurried, desperate mending performed by candlelight. You consider the monumental effort required to process the raw wool, the endless hours of shearing, carding, spinning, and weaving that produce this life-saving garment. You appreciate the coarse fabric, not for its comfort, but for its sheer, unyielding density, the vital barrier it forms against the lethal forces of the winter storm. You bury your nose deeper into the foul-smelling cloth, trapping a tiny sphere of warm condensation against your freezing face. Time stretches endlessly across the pre-dawn hour, testing the limits of human sanity and pushing the sensory deprivation into a sprawling, agonizing ordeal. The lack of visual input forces the mind to invent its own landscapes. Your brain projects hazy, chaotic memories of the bustling market square onto the pitch-black canvas of the room. The ghost of a shouted argument over the price of barley echoes in your memory, an auditory hallucination triggered by the profound, unnatural silence. The mind struggles to find an anchor in the void, desperate for any solid confirmation that the outside world still exists beyond the frozen timber of the door. The absolute darkness becomes a physical weight pressing against your closed eyelids, a suffocating pressure that threatens to crush your fragile consciousness. You shift your weight on the wooden platform, the movement triggering a sharp chorus of pops and cracks from your frozen joints. You analyze the pain radiating from your lower back, recognizing the familiar, deep-seated ache that comes from hauling heavy buckets of well water across the icy lanes. You remember the terrifying, slippery texture of the packed snow near the communal well, the constant threat of a bone-breaking fall hovering over every desperate chore. You carefully stretch your legs, minimizing the rustling of the dry straw, prioritizing caution and deliberate movement to protect your battered frame. Frost encases the small clay jug resting near the hearthstones, holding a solid block of frozen well water within its brittle walls. The expanding ice has formed a tiny, jagged peak at the narrow opening, threatening to shatter the vessel from internal pressure. The trapped water holds microscopic fragments of silt and unseen contamination, a biological hazard that the freezing temperatures merely suspend rather than eliminate. The knowledge that this lethal liquid must eventually be boiled and consumed adds a layer of quiet dread to the impending morning routine. The simple acquisition of safe hydration remains a towering, daily obstacle, a logistical nightmare that defines the struggle of the 12th century peasantry. You listen to the erratic scratching of a louse moving across your scalp, the tiny parasite unbothered by the plunging temperatures of the hovel. You suppress the overwhelming urge to dig your dirty fingernails into the itch. Breaking the seal of your blanket would expose your arm to the biting draft circulating above the mattress. You accept the infestation as a permanent condition of your existence, a biological tax levied against the poor who lack access to hot water and clean linen. You feel the creature navigate the greasy, tangled strands of your hair, a microscopic violation of your personal space that you are powerless to prevent. You focus your aggression inward. You channel the frustration into a rigid, unyielding determination to outlast the vermin, the cold, and the endless dark. Oak planks stand as the final desperate barricade between the fragile warmth of the cottage and the killing cold of the open valley. The thick iron latch rests securely in its housing, coated in a delicate layer of white hoarfrost that sparkles invisibly in the black void. The leather hinges, stiff and brittle from the freezing air, wait silently to groan in protest when the first light finally demands the opening of the barrier. The heavy wood serves as a vital shield, an architectural necessity that dictates the boundary between survival and immediate, freezing death. You visualize the massive stone structure of the parish church looming over the snow-covered roofs of the village, an imposing silhouette against the gray sky. You recall the suffocating smell of beeswax candles and damp stone that fills the nave during the mandatory Sunday Mass. You hear the priest's voice echoing in the vaulted space, delivering Latin warnings of divine judgment that feel terrifyingly real in the grip of the winter famine. You cross yourself again beneath the heavy wool blanket, a desperate automatic plea for intervention delivered to a deity who seems remarkably indifferent to the suffering of the lower classes. You understand that faith forms the only permitted armor against the unknown. Religious devotion operates as an acquired psychological defense mechanism in a world far beyond your control. Salvaged timber forms the small, uneven wooden stool abandoned near the buried hearth, its three mismatched legs resting unevenly on the packed dirt floor. The rough surface of the seat bears the polished marks of countless evenings spent huddled close to the flames, a physical record of the desperate search for warmth. The crude piece of furniture stands as a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering, held together with wooden pegs rather than expensive iron nails. It represents the absolute baseline of medieval domestic comfort, a minor elevation above the freezing mud that passes for a luxury in this squalid environment. The stool waits patiently in the dark, a silent witness to the endless, shivering vigils that define the winter nights. You run your tongue over your cracked, bleeding lips, tasting the familiar copper tang of your own blood in the freezing air. You feel the deep fissures in the delicate skin, wounds caused by the relentless wind and the severe lack of proper nutrition. You know that these minor afflictions will not heal until the spring thaw brings the promise of fresh greens and a reprieve from the biting frost. You set your jaw with a renewed, grim resolve, refusing to let the creeping lethargy of the cold compromise your strict mental discipline. Deep charcoal gray filters into the pitch-black void, an agonizingly subtle shift that signals the Earth's rotation toward the distant sun. The suffocating density of the darkness begins to lose its absolute grip on the interior of the wattle and daub hovel. You watch the faintest outline of the wooden door frame emerge from the gloom. The blurred rectangle confirms your survival through the deadliest hours of the cycle. You prepare your stiff, aching muscles for the inevitable shock of rising from the straw. The brutal labor of the 12th century awaits just beyond the threshold. You pull the heavy cloak away from your face, inhaling the freezing air directly into your lungs. The relentless march of the medieval morning approaches. You swing your frozen legs over the edge of the wooden platform, the sudden movement sending a fresh cascade of aches through your lower back. You brace your bare feet against the packed earth floor, feeling the freezing dampness bite instantly into your soles. You stand up, your knees popping in the quiet room, protesting the shift from horizontal endurance to vertical labor. You wrap the heavy cloak securely around your waist, binding it with a knotted leather strap to trap whatever body heat remains. You stare at the gray light leaking through the shutters, knowing that the fields demand your blood, sweat, and obedience once again. Frozen leather hinges scream in protest as you push the heavy oak door open, shattering the morning silence of the village. The stiff leather struggles against the built-up ice, requiring a violent shove of your shoulder to break the seal. The freezing air rushes into the hovel, stinging your eyes and snatching the stale, smoky warmth from the cramped interior. The narrow lane outside lies buried under a fresh layer of pristine white snow, unmarked by footprints or wagon wheels. The village holds its collective breath in these final moments before the church bell summons the laborers back to their unending, punishing servitude. You stand motionless in the open doorway. The anticipated cacophony of the waking village never materializes. A vast, unbroken wall of falling snow meets your gaze, obscuring the familiar outlines of the neighboring cottages. The sheer volume of the storm transforms the world into a localized, isolated pocket of existence. You watch the thick flakes accumulate on the threshold, piling up against the edges of your leather turnshoes. The bitter wind has vanished, replaced by a suffocating, soundless pressure that commands the valley. This is not a morning meant for human labor. The earth itself has mandated a halt. Heavy precipitation continues to bury the landscape under a pristine, suffocating layer of white. The usual ruts and foul gutters of the central lane disappear beneath the accumulating drifts. Even the towering silhouette of the stone church fades into the swirling monochromatic haze. The storm operates with a relentless, unhurried efficiency, erasing the visual evidence of the peasant community. Every muddy footprint and discarded piece of refuse vanishes under the pure, freezing blanket. The weather exerts an authority that supersedes the commands of the overseer or the tolling of the bell. You recognize the rare gift of this overwhelming natural event. The village cannot function when the paths become impassable rivers of deep powder. The plows cannot turn the frozen, buried earth, and the livestock must remain securely tethered within their shelters. You understand that the brutal machinery of the 12th century economy has ground to an unexpected halt. The immediate panic of failing to reach your assigned furrow dissolves into a stunned disbelief. You draw a long, freezing breath into your lungs, tasting the metallic purity of the falling snow. The reprieve is temporary, but the relief crashing through your exhausted body feels monumental. Scent from the winter squall carries a sharp, elemental bite that clears the lingering smoke from your sinuses. It smells of crushed pine needles and distant frozen rivers, a wild fragrance that belongs to the untamed forests beyond the manor borders. You notice the absence of the typical morning odors, the rotting vegetation and animal waste safely sealed beneath the ice. The pristine air burns the back of your throat, a harsh reminder of the lethal temperatures driving the storm. You let the wild wind wash over your face, scrubbing away the grime and exhaustion of the previous day. The sheer scale of the blizzard forces a sudden, humbling perspective upon your small, fragile life. You reach with a thick iron ring bolted to the exterior of the heavy oak door. The freezing metal bites instantly into the raw skin of your palm, a stinging contact that forces a wince. You throw your weight backward, pulling the massive timber frame against the resistance of the packed snow on the threshold. The stiff leather hinges groan in loud protest as the gap narrows, slicing off the view of the white oblivion. You drill the iron bolt across the housing with a definitive, metallic clang that seals the hovel. The sudden return of the interior gloom feels less like a prison and more like a granted sanctuary. Absolute darkness floods back into the corners of the cramped, single-room dwelling. The ambient light filtering through the oiled linen window provides just enough illumination to navigate the uneven earth floor. You release a ragged exhale, the sound echoing loudly in the enclosed, echoing space. The immediate threat of the open fields has been postponed, offering a few stolen hours of unanticipated shelter. You wrap the heavy wool cloak tighter around your waist, binding the coarse fabric to trap your remaining body heat. The transition from survival panic to unexpected rest leaves your mind reeling in the dim light. You turn your attention toward the dormant hearth sitting in the center of the room. The gray ash pit holds the only potential source of comfort in the freezing cottage. You approach the stone circle with cautious reverence, treating the buried embers like fragile, precious jewels. You drop to your knees on the hard dirt, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain in your joints. The cold floor radiates a biting chill through the thin fabric of your hosen, a reminder of the ever-present winter threat. You pick up the small iron shovel, ready to resurrect the life-saving flames. Salvaged timber forms the small wooden stool waiting patiently just beyond the edge of the fire pit. Its crude, uneven legs cast faint, distorted shadows against the mud plaster as you begin your work. The rough surface of the seat bears the polished marks of countless hours spent huddled near the heat. You push the piece of furniture aside to give yourself more room to maneuver around the stones. The simple utilitarian object serves as a physical anchor in the sparse, functional space. You rely on these familiar items to maintain your orientation in a world stripped of comfort. You drag the metal edge of the shovel through the thick layer of accumulated ash. The scraping sound sets your teeth on edge, a harsh noise in the muted silence of the room. You uncover a small pulsing cluster of crimson coals hidden deep within the gray dust. The residual heat from the embers brushes against your face, a microscopic promise of impending relief. You feed a handful of brittle, dried moss directly onto the glowing censer. You lower your head, positioning your lips just inches from the fuel to deliver a controlled stream of oxygen. You watch the tiny spark flare instantly into a bright, consuming ribbon of orange flame. The sudden illumination pushes the shadows back against the water walls, revealing the intricate patterns of the woven branches. You carefully layer several thin oak twigs over the burning moss, constructing a delicate pyramid of combustible material. The wood pops and hisses, releasing small jets of trapped sap that flare brilliant yellow. The fire demands your unbroken focus, a delicate chemical reaction that must be nurtured with exact precision. You watch the flames multiply and climb, establishing a secure foothold in the center of the hearth. You grab a larger split log from the meager pile resting near the door frame. The wood feels heavy and dense, promising hours of sustained, radiant heat. You place the timber across the roaring kindling, adjusting the angle to ensure maximum airflow through the center of the blaze. The bark catches quickly, sending a fresh wave of thick, aromatic smoke spiraling upward toward the thatched roof. The physical exertion of building the fire sends a surge of adrenaline through your veins. You rock back on your heels, allowing the growing warmth to wash over your shivering torso. Thermal radiation begins to push outward from the stone circle in a concentrated, expanding wave. The heat strikes the frozen wool of your cloak, melting the accumulated frost into tiny, glistening droplets. You hold your raw, blistered hands directly over the flames, relishing the fierce, stinging pain of thawing tissue. The stiff joints in your fingers unlock, regaining their flexibility as the blood vessels expand. You turn your palms upward, exposing the calluses and cuts to the purifying, dry heat. The simple luxury of a roaring fire eclipses any other desire in the freezing 12th century landscape. You unlace your wet, stiffened turn shoes, pulling them free from your numb feet. The leather has frozen into rigid, uncomfortable shapes that scrape against your heels during the removal. You place the footwear near the edge of the hot stones, allowing the radiant heat to dry the saturated material. You massage your bare toes, working the sluggish circulation back into the pale, wrinkled skin. The earth floor beneath you begins to warm, the frozen mud yielding slightly to the rising temperature. You stretch your legs out toward the hearth, finding a momentary, glorious reprieve from the endless chill. You hear the tethered goat exhale a long, misty breath from its corner of the room. The animal shifts its weight, moving closer to the limit of its rope to share in the newly established heat. You hear the rhythmic grinding of its teeth as it chews a mouthful of dry hay. The presence of the beast provides a comforting, living counterpart in the isolated space. The musky scent of its fleece mingles with the sharp wood smoke, creating the definitive aroma of your domestic sanctuary. You glance at the creature, acknowledging the shared relief of surviving another freezing dawn. You watch the intricate ice patterns on the wattle walls begin to weep. The delicate crystalline structures surrendered to the rising ambient temperature of the room. Water droplets form along the edges of the mud plaster, catching the orange firelight like tiny liquid gems. The freezing barrier that threatened to consume the hovel retreats, melting away under the assault of the roaring oak. You observe the architectural thaw with a sense of victorious relief. The fire has pushed the lethal winter back beyond the threshold, reclaiming the interior space for the living. Melted frost traces irregular paths down the crude, uneven surfaces of the walls. The water carries decades of accumulated soot and dirt toward the floor, leaving dark, vertical streaks across the plaster. The moisture pools at the base of the timber framing, soaking silently into the packed earth. You note the damage, knowing that the walls will require fresh daubing when the spring finally arrives. The maintenance of the structure remains a constant, unavoidable chore. You dismiss the future labor, focusing solely on the immediate comfort of the melting ice. You pull the small wooden stool closer to the edge of the hearth. You sink onto the polished seat, releasing a heavy, exhausted sigh that echoes in the hushed room. The localized thaw penetrates the stiff, aching muscles of your lower back, unraveling the knots of tension earned in the fields. You slump forward, resting your elbows on your knees, leaning your entire body toward the life-giving flames. The sheer relief of the heat induces a sudden, overwhelming wave of physical lethargy. You allow your battered frame to go limp, supported only by the crude wooden furniture. You track a sharp pop from a burning sap pocket that sends a shower of red sparks dancing into the air. The tiny embers drift upward, tracing erratic, glowing spirals before winking out in the smoky gloom. You follow their flight with half-closed eyes, hypnotized by the chaotic, beautiful motion of the fire. The rhythmic crackle of the consuming wood creates a percussive, mesmerizing soundtrack in the enclosed space. The noise effectively blocks out the howling wind and the rustling vermin, dominating your auditory senses. You surrender your attention to the flames, entering a trance-like state of pure, mindless observation. You feel the tight knot of anxiety in your chest finally begin to loosen. The constant, grinding terror of failing to meet the manor's labor quotas dissolves in the face of the massive blizzard. The overseer cannot demand the impossible, and the frozen earth refuses to yield to the plow. You recognize that you have been granted a full day of unquestionable, mandatory rest. The realization washes over you like a physical wave, stripping away the mental armor you wear to survive the feudal system. You breathe deeply, savoring the unprecedented sensation of having no immediate, punishing obligations. Crushing demands of the 12th century economy remain suspended beyond the thick timber walls. The market square sits empty, the mill wheel frozen solid in the iced-over stream. The relentless machinery of peasant life has paused, offering a rare, hushed parenthesis in the ongoing struggle for survival. You sit in the center of this unexpected pause, a solitary figure claiming a stolen moment of peace. The world has shrunk to the radius of the firelight, a manageable warm sphere that requires nothing from you but your presence. You embrace the isolation. Finding a deep, restorative sanctuary in the snowbound hovel, you adjust the heavy wool cloak across your thawing shoulders. The fabric feels lighter now, the moisture evaporating into the heated air of the room. You run your thumb along the frayed edge of the garment, feeling the coarse, undyed fibers beneath your calluses. The material retains a comforting, dense weight that grounds you in the physical present. You pull the hood down, allowing the radiant heat to penetrate the matted, greasy strands of your hair. The simple act of unburdening yourself feels like a massive, luxurious indulgence. Rich aromas of heated fleece and wood ash saturate the enclosed space. The smell is thick, earthy, and intensely familiar, representing the absolute essence of your home. You inhale the scent, letting it fill your lungs and overwrite the metallic bite of the winter storm. The olfactory environment provides a powerful psychological anchor, signaling to your brain that the immediate danger has passed. You let your head drop forward, your chin resting against your chest, the tension bleeding out of your neck. The hovel feels secure, a fortress of mud and timber holding the lethal cold at bay. You trace the outline of a loose stone near the edge of the fire pit with your toe. The smooth, heated surface of the rock provides a comforting tactile sensation against your bare skin. You memorize the exact shape of the uneven floorboards, the scattered rushes, the chipped clay jug resting in the corner. You notice the tiny, overlooked details of your existence, brought into sharp focus by the sudden abundance of idle time. The specific texture of the ash, the precise color of the oak bark, the subtle variations in the wattle weave, all demand your measured contemplation. You study your environment with the deliberate attention of a person who has nowhere else to be. Glowing embers shift within the core of the fire, collapsing inward with a faint, crumbling sound. The movement exposes a fresh layer of white-hot coals that radiate a renewed burst of thermal energy. You watch the heat waves distort the air above the hearth, creating a shimmering, mirage-like effect in the center of the room. The visual distortion blurs the hard edges of the crude furniture and the muddy walls. The harsh reality of your squalid living conditions softens, taking on a warm golden hue in the flickering light. You allow your gaze to lose its focus, blurring the room into an abstract painting of orange and shadow. You listen to the faint, continuous whisper of the snowfall pressing against the exterior of the thatched roof. The sound is muffled and distant, a subtle, hushed friction that emphasizes the thickness of your shelter. It serves as a constant, soothing reminder of the impenetrable barrier isolating you from the demanding world. The rhythm of the falling flakes acts like a natural lullaby, a soundless drone that quiets the racing, panicked thoughts of survival. You match your breathing to the unhurried pace of the storm, slowing your heart rate to a calm, measured thud. Ancient oak beams overhead emit a long, structural groan as they settle into the freezing temperatures. The sound is deep and resonant, the timber speaking a language of tension and endurance that you understand perfectly. The house is fighting the same battle you are, holding its shape against the crushing weight of the medieval winter. You find a strange solidarity with the inanimate architecture, recognizing the shared, stubborn refusal to collapse. You press your hand against the supporting post nearest the hearth, feeling the solid, unyielding grain of the ancient wood. You sink deeper into the natural, polished contour of the wooden stool. Your muscles surrender their final, stubborn reserves of defensive tension, leaving your body heavy and fully relaxed. The relentless aches in your joints fade to a dull, distant murmur, masked by the overwhelming, penetrating heat of the fire. You feel a profound, heavy lethargy spreading through your limbs, a liquid weariness that pulls in your hands and feet. The exhaustion of the past week, previously held back by sheer willpower, breaches your mental defenses. You do not fight the incoming tide of fatigue, you welcome it. You hear the specific, granular scrape of a dying spark hitting the stone hearth. The tiny, distinct hiss of the ember expiring against the damp earth reaches your ears. You notice the precise, heavy drape of the linen shirt resting against your collarbone. The faint, rhythmic shifting of the goat's hooves provides a grounding metronome in the background. The microsensory details of the room expand, filling your awareness as the larger worries of the feudal world fade away. You exist only in this immediate sensory present, floating in a cocoon of radiating heat. You feel the exact weight of the woven blanket pressing against your chest. The smell of cooling tallow from an unlit candle rests faintly in the air, mingling with the dark scent of oak smoke. You perceive the subtle difference in temperature between the air near the floor and the air near your face. The faint creak of a settling floor timber resonates through the soles of your resting feet. You feel the specific texture of the frayed wool hem resting against your chin. The distant scrape of an icy branch brushing against the water wall marks the final passing of the storm. Fading crackle of the wood shifting into white ash signals the end of your long vigil. You close your eyes. Let the dark take you gently. Another quiet history will be here when you wake.